So now we're going to talk about templates. One of the most awesome things about front-end frameworks, it's like, that's always like the unique thing about front-end frameworks. Like, how do they do their templates? You know, so I think this is pretty cool. If you're familiar with Angular 1, you'll see some things that you're kind of like, okay, I get it. But most of it's like, that's not even valid. How are they doing that? But it's valid, trust me. I looked it up. I was
on the internet.
I was like, that's, no. Oh, okay, it works, never mind. Cool, so templates. A lot of things when we talk about templates. Here's some of the main points, the crux. We have interpolation, which is not new. Every template system, that's the base of a template system, all the way down to a small one like Lodash. So we have interpolation, use the same syntax. Method binding, property binding, and two-way binding. So we'll talk about the differences between those three and really get into it. And we have like this hashtag operator, which is new, an asterisk operator, which is new, and then the Elvis operator, which is actually what they call it on the Angular docs.
That's been around since like the 50s.
It's been around a while.
Shows up once in a while.
He's right on the wall. Lucas made an Elvis joke.
So we'll talk about that stuff. So here's a little graphic that Lucas just did so well. He's an artist. That's just going to symbolize. It's actually, I think you guys got a graphic earlier today. This is like a little piece from it that just kind of goes through what the template and what's happening between the template and the component and the relationship there. So property binding is most of the data is unidirectional, so it's going one direction. With there's one caveat of one, but we'll get to that in a minute. So property binding comes from the component and it binds to properties in the template, and not attributes. It's very important that we like separate the two. Properties are part of the DOM. Attributes are part of HTML. Two different things. Now some people get confused because most properties have mappings to attributes. So that's what they're like, oh, it's binding to the attribute. It's not. It's binding to a property. It's very important that you realize that because some of them don't switch over. Like call span. There is no property for that, but there's an attribute for that and stuff like that. Text content. There's a property for that, but there's not an attribute for that. So they don't really match. So we're binding to properties. We're not binding to attributes. There are some attribute bindings that we can do that Angular provided for us, and we can talk about those in a little bit, but we're binding to properties one way. And then event binding is when we bind to an event that is secured either from the DOM or an event that we created ourselves, a unique event or a new event that we made, and then our component can respond to that. And that's pretty much how templates and components work. Any questions on that? Almost the same as Angular 1, pretty much. So interpolation up top, we see the values between the two mustaches there. Unidirectional, going straight to the template from the component. Properties use the square brackets, and we'll get into more of the syntax in a little bit, but also like interpolation above it, it's going from the component to the template. Events are going the other way. So the events come from the templates and we handle them in the component. And then below we have the one example of the two-way data binding, which is what we're used to in Angular 1, where it just goes both ways, which is really, really handy for forms. Probably the only reason to use two-way data binding is for forms. I can't think of any other way, any other reason why you would use it, in my opinion. Any questions on this stuff?
I have one small comment,
Yes.
just to kind of lay some groundwork. If you notice that property binding is from the component to the template, and the event is from the template to the component, you can start to think of those as essentially, because they're unidirectional, as input and output. So start to think about those relationships, because once we get into smart and dumb components, we'll start to leverage this quite heavily with the input and output metadata, and basically saying, I'm putting this thing in and I'm binding to it, or when something happens, I want to surface it and I want to get it back out. So property bindings, event bindings are kind of the foundation for creating well-encapsulated components via input and output.
Yeah. If you come from React, you can think of it as the property is just like, I'm passing in some stuff, to this component, and the event handler is just like, here's a function I want to happen when this event happens. Very similar. Whereas the property handlers don't actually go a step further and bind to the DOM, but as far as like passing it to the component, it's very similar. All right, so interpolation. It's really not that new from Angular 1, but so this is going to allow us to bind to component properties in and out the template, define with the curly braces, the curly brace syntax. We can bind to methods as well, and Angular converts interpolation to property binding. So the sweet thing about interpolation is that it uses a JavaScript-like syntax. It's not full JavaScript. We can't use all valid JavaScript in interpolation. Like for instance, the bitwise operators like pipe and we can't use those. Why? Because Angular uses pipes for pipes. We don't get access to global namespace, so we can't do console.log or math.max. We can't do that. We don't get access to any of that. Where the interpolation is scoped in the context of the component that it's in or a local variable. So we don't get access. So you can't do all JavaScript there. But we can do pretty much, inside those rules, we can pretty much do any expression that we want. Does that make sense? So any other than those rules that I was talking about, we can do any valid expression inside of here. So an expression is just going to bind to a target. It's going to create a value. That's what an expression does.